Hey everyone, welcome back to the GeoInterview. Today, we're glad to have with us Arthur Holland Michel, who is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. Also, he's the founder of the Center for the Study of Drone at Bard College. And today, with Arthur, we're going to be talking about some of the rising or emerging next gen technologies and his perspective on what sort of impacts they have on our lives. So, Arthur, how are you?
Very well, thanks. It's really good to be here.
Yes, we're glad to have you, and we're very excited to be talking to you. Now, before we sort of dive ahead into the agenda for this interview, I would want to address the elephant in the room. And what I want to ask you is the development of AI something on which you're working a lot? Is the development of AI the steam engine moment of this 21st century? What do you think on that?
That's a big question, you know. In a way, there's no such thing as a perfect metaphor, and certainly there's no such thing as a perfect historical metaphor. It's been said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme. And in that regard, with metaphors like the steam engine, you may see some symmetries, but I would approach the question slightly differently, which is what is the value of a metaphor like that? And from my perspective, the value of a metaphor is to highlight policy issues. I work on ethical questions, policy issues, human rights issues. And so, what I'm interested in are metaphors that really serve to highlight that point us to historical examples where maybe there are some lessons to be drawn. And in that regard, I would say that um, AI is captured with sort of multiple metaphors at once. AI does so many different things that it's hard to point to one single historical example and say, that is the perfect analogy for what we're going through right now. It's true that in some respects, AI mirrors the steam engine moment of the Industrial Revolution, in that we are talking about a new technology that emerged relatively quickly and has some relatively generalizable applications, disruptive in some cases, applications across a variety of fields. But that doesn't tell us so much about the policy implications. And so in that regard, you may need to turn to metaphors like the advent of telegraph technology, which made communication much quicker, which increased significantly the speed and scale at which political messaging could happen. And that had all sorts of disruptive effects on the way democracy functioned. And we are seeing a kind of mirrored effect in the way that AI is being used, really, in all facets of political and commercial messaging, both in a sort of nefarious way and a more, educational way, shall we say. I'll give you one other, not to bore you with sort of historical examples, but maybe one other metaphor that could be significant is the advent of the wiretap for listening in on people's phone conversations. You know, uh, Previously, people had a significant, shall we say, even perhaps total expectation of privacy when they were on the phone. And then starting in the sort of 1920s, this technology came along that allowed that space to be intruded upon. And in a similar way, we are seeing today, and we're going to get into this, I believe, a little later in the conversation, how AI is enabling this sort of activation of surveillance to look into our lives in ways that previously wasn't possible, and into spaces that we sort of assumed no one was looking at us, right? And so if we look at those individual metaphors, we get a little bit more sort of policy juice from the squeeze. So again, maybe not the most satisfying answer, but certainly I think a perhaps helpful way to think about some of this stuff.
Okay. So you talked about the policy implications, right, when it comes to AI. And having gone across your work, surveillance is something also that you have talked about a lot, right? Be it in the book that you've written, or let's just say all of the things that you've written or you've talked about. Now, with that in mind, I want to come to, let's just say, the dynamics between the policy or the surveillance, right? Because again, in 2019, you came up with this book, which was The Rise of the Gorgon Stare, right? So with that, what I want to ask you is, could you tell us something about that and how that, maybe as an example, could you tell us how are these emerging technologies, let's just say for surveillance or for something else, how are they impacting our lives as of now?
So the fundamental policy tension or contradiction when it comes to surveillance technology, in particular surveillance technology, is that policies and rules and regulations and restrictions on surveillance are necessarily crafted around existing technologies. Uh, those who employ surveillance technologies will do everything within what these rules permit. That's why it's very important to set these boundaries. As soon as something comes along that exists outside of those definitional boundaries, it suddenly operates in a sort of gray space, in a space in which there are essentially no kind of pre-existing a priori restrictions on its use, right? So to give you a tangible example, let's say that you have a police department that, as part of its toolkit for criminal investigations, does stakeouts. You know, it follows people around, right? And policymakers recognize that this is potentially a pretty dangerous activity if abused. And so they create certain rules around when the police are and are not allowed to follow a particular person around. They have to, say, for the sake of argument, have some basis of suspicion, some probable cause to believe that this person should be followed around because that will yield information that's relevant to a criminal investigation. And so they make a rule that says, you know, you can only follow a person around in a car if X, Y, and Z criteria are met. But then a technology comes around that enables you to follow that person's car around by other means, right? So maybe it is that instead of chasing them with your own car, you attach a little GPS tracking device to their vehicle, and then you just watch it as it moves around. Or maybe you buy commercial data related to that person's cell phone, right, and their location tracking. Well, since the regulation says that you can only use a car when you've got, say, probable cause, there's nothing to stop you from following that person around for other reasons that don't meet that criteria by simply using, you know, GPS or commercial cell phone data. And so there you have to, you know, change the regulations in a way that, you know, there's a different dynamic compared to other spaces where, you know, that there might be a little more in the way of sort of self-regulation by actors, where they say, oh, you know, we recognize this may be problematic. Certain, not all, but certain, you know, commercial AI companies in the generative space say, you know, they realize that there are no regulations, and they say, oh, well, we should, you know, we should probably set our own limits until we can have regulations. In the surveillance space, police, law enforcement are so desperate to catch, you know, criminals. They're so desperate to kind of do their mission that they'll do anything that is allowed within the rules and also anything that is not specifically forbidden by the rules. And so, that has tremendous implications at a time when new surveillance technologies are emerging and proliferating at an astonishing rate. I mean, the number of different instruments of surveillance that are available to law enforcement now compared to, say, 5 years ago is truly extraordinary. And given the other dynamic that we know about in surveillance, which is that when a technology is not explicitly regulated, there is a very high probability, in fact, over a long enough time scale, a total probability that it will be abused in some way. It will be used in some way that crosses the lines of, basic human rights principles. That's a very dangerous uh, combination, and I think a certainly unprecedented combination in kind of the history of surveillance, something that I think really we should be focusing on a lot.
Okay. So, while you were describing, in numerous ways, you just highlighted how, let's just say, the surveillance system is getting more robust, it's getting more complicated, right? So, while I still have other questions in mind, but first, given the state that you've highlighted, right, and as someone who I would say is an insider when it comes to the industry, right, you would certainly know slightly more than the common perception, which is yes, of course, we're getting surveyed or the surveillance system is robust. So, given the state that you've highlighted, is there any way, is there even a way that's out of it? Like, how do we even begin to regulate these systems? Because it seems that where the technology sits and where are the policies as of now, there's just a stark difference in terms of, how fast is the technology catching up and how slow, let's just say, the policies are catching up to them. So, is there
Yeah.
even a way out of it?
So you phrase the question in exactly the right way, which is where do we begin to build policy, right? Often uh, the question is phrased differently, which is how could we possibly build policy? This seems so complex. These technologies are moving so quickly. How could we possibly catch up to this, steamrolling rate of progress? Um, and it can seem, like a completely insurmountable challenge. But if you look at it from your perspective, which is where do we begin, I think there is a little more cause for hope and practical action. And what I always say is the place where policy formulation begins is in transparency. You absolutely cannot have lawmakers taking action on a particular technological issue um, unless they know what's going on. And just as importantly, in a democratic system, unless the population sees what's going on, understands its implications, and then demands policy action from those policymakers. The unfortunate reality is that when it comes to surveillance, those conducting surveillance prefer to operate in the dark. That's simply in their nature. That is the name of the game. Um, and so it has to be a sort of active demand for transparency in order for this information that's relevant to sort of kickstart the policy process to come to light. And that's why there has actually been a lot of um, sort of advocacy work and some regulation in recent years in demanding that law enforcement agencies disclose anytime they acquire a new technology. And that creates an opening for policymakers to say, look, okay, we have this agency, they've acquired this new technology that exists in a regulatory gray zone. Let's start by doing a study. Let's start by educating the public. Let's see what the feedback loop is on that. And that will naturally lend itself to a policy building process. I think everything else starts falling into place once you have that initial spark of transparency. And it's really, again, what I always suggest as a sort of first step in all of that. The technical aspects of policy building, every government bureaucracy has people who are capable of doing that. And certainly every time, I see my job as really raising awareness. I don't see my job as actually giving prescribed policy solutions, because that stuff is very, very technology, like I would guess you would say sort of detailed and technological, or technically detailed, technically complex, things that really require a certain amount of sort of bureaucratic expertise. My job sort of ends at the point where everybody knows about a technology and is saying, hey, we need to do something, and that kicks everything into gear.
One of the things that I really liked about how you sort of giving or telling us your perspective is just even talking about the policy making, right? How it needs to, it took you some emphasis talking about it, right? And you've highlighted your role that while you do not prescribe the exact policy solutions that need to be there, but your role is more of, let's just say, hinting at the direction or telling the people what needs to be done, right? Now, having talked about, let's just say, where to begin, I have one more question on surveillance before, let's just say, we come on to other parts of this interview, right? I, given you've been or you are the founder at the Center for the Study of Drones, can you let us know what is the story about Pentagon's Gorgon Stare? And what is this about and how does it impact all of us?
Yeah, so Gorgon Stare was a technology that was the focus of my first book, Eyes in the Sky. It was developed over a fairly long period within a variety of different US government agencies, and ultimately ended up with the Pentagon. Essentially, it is a very, very large camera. Think of a camera that is a few hundred times the size of the camera on an iPhone, with some very powerful lenses in front of it. And the idea with this technology is that if you put it on an airplane or a drone at a high altitude over a city, then it will watch everything at once. Traditionally, when you have aerial surveillance, it's like looking through a telescope. You can only look at one place on the ground, a very narrow space on the ground at once. Meaning that if you're looking at one thing, if you're following one vehicle, you are going to miss everything else that's happening. The idea with these very large cameras like Gorgon Stare is that because you don't know what you might be interested in looking at beforehand, you watch everything, and then once you know what you were interested in looking at in the past, you can rewind in the footage, zoom into a particular place, and follow whoever it is or whatever it is that is relevant to your investigation. This is a technology that came to be used very widely in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it is a technology that now has significant law enforcement implications. I will say that in the United States, ultimately, after the book was published, it was found through a court case to be unconstitutional, a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Um, that's not to say that it could not be used or is not currently in use in other countries. Um, there are certain limitations with this technology, being that it's used on aircraft. It's very expensive to maintain an aircraft in the sky at all times. There's clouds, things of that nature, and it's problematic. But we're starting to see those same technological components crop up in other ways. So often cities are deploying cameras that have some of the same capabilities on top of very high, tall buildings. Satellites are starting to have some of these same capabilities as well. And there is, of course, the technologies of data fusion, which accomplish this same effect of watching everything at once and then putting the pieces together afterwards, that you get with a single system like Gorgon Stare. It's a cool story, the details of which I won't go into now, but there's definitely some interesting history with Gorgon Stare that I think serves as a pretty valuable object lesson about how surveillance technologies emerge in the shadows and suddenly have implications for all of us that we need to move very quickly to deal with.
Okay. How you almost ended up talking about the Gorgon stairs, like, something that was almost hidden and now it's suddenly come up and then we find it sounds like a Batman movie, right? But then maybe let's just say we could do another podcast specifically dedicated onto this, this rise. With that, I would want to come to, so we talked about surveillance, right? But I want to talk about the means with which now some of that surveillance is being done. And again, foremost of that being AI. And what particularly I want to ask about is that now when AI, we find AI being used so much when it comes to surveillance. So there's this notion, or people have started talking about the biases that AI might have. Do you think that this biases that, again, which could be based upon the selective usage of the data, do you think AI can have biases like these? And of course, you would say yes to that most probably. But if that's a yes, in what sort of ways do you think these biases can affect, let's just say, a normal human being?
Yeah. Well, you're right. The answer is yes. Um, there's a common fallacy or a misconception about AI that certain AI systems are not biased, and it's just that there is a sort of propensity for bias. Um, the reality is that you have to build some amount of bias into any AI system. There is no AI system in the world that is unbiased, because what unbiased means from a technical perspective is that this AI system is a perfect model of the world or the thing that it is trying to, quote, understand. And of course, that's simply not the case. Bias emerges because of a whole variety of factors, some of which are intentional and some of which are unintentional. In the case of AI systems, the significant risk around bias is that these systems are trained on historical data that is most likely to reflect certain social inequalities in the way that the justice system um, chooses who to watch, decides who to punish, and decides how to punish. And so, in that regard, when you have a system that has those biases, and then you have that system interact with human users who also have their own biases, and a justice system that has inbuilt biases, you have a kind of multiplication effect, which is very, very problematic for the demographic groups that have historically and who continue to be um, uh, treated unfairly by these systems. The added concern is that because these systems are often trained in a recursive manner with new data that becomes available, if these systems generate biased results and that leads to biased outcomes, and then those biased outcomes become data that train a new iteration of the system, then that new system will be even more biased. And an example of that is, let's say you have a system that, in an abstract sense, is designed to alert the police to suspicious activities through pattern matching. And that's trained on historically biased data, and so it's more likely to identify patterns that are associated with the activities in a certain area of a city or certain demographic groups. That leads the police to spend more time in those areas investigating these biased activities. That leads to more arrests, more convictions, which then becomes data to feed the new system. Your question was, what does it mean for us? What it means for us is that if you are among one of those groups that is disproportionately either overrepresented or underrepresented in the training sets for systems that then are used for surveillance, you can get trapped in a very, very dangerous feedback loop. And it's especially dangerous because these feedback loops can be very, very hard to detect until it is way too late. They can be very hard to detect until you have an overwhelming statistical signal that something is terribly off balance, because some of these biases were undetectable from the start, and they might have microscopic focuses, focal points, where they really maybe are disproportionately over or underrepresentative of a very, very, very specific group with a very specific certain set of characteristics. And those auditing these systems, those overseeing these systems, they simply cannot check for every possible way in which a system is mismatched with the population that it is watching. That puts us in a really precarious situation because, if a person doesn't know how and whether and the degree to which a system might be biased against them, it's very hard for them to go to their local law enforcement agency or their local senator and say, I need to demand action on this. That being said, there is enough information out there now that demands can be made for systems to be audited way before they're deployed, which is at least a good start in catching a lot of these issues before they actually turn into tangible harms.
All right. A lot to, I would say, dissect within that, right? A lot of parameters wherein we could go. But having said that, I think it's time that we move on from surveillance. And maybe it's time for a rookie question that I have, right? Now, again, AI job losses, everyone seems to be talking about it. But let's just say someone, again, who works around these systems, do you see AI actually sort of displacing, let's just say, millions of jobs? Is that something that you envision that could happen?
This is a question that I've been interested in for a long time, and it is one that I still don't have a clear answer on. I think that going back to historical analogies, whenever we have seen automating technologies become common within particular industries, and despite the fact that those automating technologies often multiply the productivity of individual humans or allow jobs that previously required 20 humans to be done by a single individual, we didn't see major sort of lasting effects on the unemployment levels. It is true that a lot of the work that is done today, especially in the kind of business administrative space, is stuff that generative AI seems to be fairly okay at, like writing emails. I mean, if you just think in your day-to-day activities, how much time you spend just writing pretty boring, repetitive emails, maybe there is the question of, okay, if you don't have to spend those 3 hours a day doing that, where are you going to go? At the same time, we're also seeing a bit of a kind of, you might call it like a whiplash effect, where employers are being perhaps a little hasty in letting people go because of their ability to automate certain roles. Because we still actually don't have all the data on how effective these systems are at replacing us in the long term. We know that on a day-to-day basis, maybe on a week-to-week basis, they can reduce the total number of work hours required for a particular task by X amount. But we don't know if that'll sort of continue to be the case over on the months long scale or the years long scale. So maybe we're seeing a bit of a kind of false signal in terms of the job losses that have already happened as a result of AI, and there will be some kind of equilibrium. But to me, the more interesting question is not so much whether people will have jobs or not. That's very important, of course. But to me, it's more, what are the effects on the population at large and on our communal intellectual health if people en masse forget how to write an email? If people en masse forget actually how to string a sentence together or an argument together in a way that is both succinct and effective and original and reflective of their own feelings and ideas and motivations. There could be a significant, cultural and intellectual and skill-based loss in that, that is not the same as the loss that happens when suddenly no one is able to wield a hammer as a result of industrial automation. Because now we're not talking about the loss of some dexterity-based skill. We're talking about the loss of a skill that is, right up here, that is fundamental to the act of communicating. And I'm a little concerned about that. I'm not going to lie. I'm a little worried. And I think there's something to be said for maybe, you know, I know I could get ChatGPT to write this email for me, but maybe I'm just going to write it anyway. It's going to be a hassle. It's going to be hard. It's going to be tough. Maybe I should just keep that muscle active, because who knows, someday, we'll really need that muscle and there's not going to be a ChatGPT that we can turn to, and then we're really stuffed.
The way you highlighted it is makes my mind really think about that. It's not so much really about the jobs, because let's just say jobs somehow or the other way, how a civilization is, people are going, or even if not people, politicians are going to secure ways for people to be employed. But it's more so about, let's just say, again, as you highlighted, what sort of cognitive effect would it have on us if, let's just say, we cannot even draft a mail, or we sort of, outsource these muscles to, let's just say, AI systems. With that, I think we come to the end of this conversation. But before we actually conclude it, I would want, and again, this is not to the, let's just say, the technical person in you that I ask this question, right? Or not, let's just say, to the industrial person in you, not that technical perspective, but as a human, right? Or let's just say, as a normal person, when we are seeing these technologies rising up, and supposedly they seem much larger than, let's just say, what our impact could be on them, right? These overarching technologies, how, let's just say, one should look at these technologies, and what sort of perspective does one need to have as we're increasingly getting surrounded by, let's just say, a barrage of emerging next gen technologies, if I could say that.
I think for people who work in our field, people who read about this stuff every day, it can often feel like it's everywhere and the doomsday is nigh, that we're right on the precipice. But if you step outside, take a long walk, maybe strike up a conversation with someone at the bar or at the bus stop, chances are they're not as perturbed by these things as you are. Chances are they they see everything else that's going on, and they have more perspective actually on the implications of technology than we do. Because for us, there's an availability bias. You know, every newsletter that I get in my inbox, every news article that I see on my social media feeds, every email I get is about AI and drones and surveillance. Um, but you know, people who work at, I don't know, supermarkets or nursery schools or farmers, you know, there are other things that are going on, and they still see all of the human-based stuff that has happened and will continue to happen. And um, you know, I think it is valuable for us to sort of get out of our cocoon, um, you know, from time to time. And this is certainly what I'm trying to do. You know, taking up another hobby, I think, is very, very valuable in that respect, um, because otherwise the barrage of information is a little too much. Also, keep in mind that you know because AI is so headline grabby, it's every single time there is even a minor kind of breakthrough, it becomes a headline, and that becomes the focus of that day's news cycle, right? And often when the dust settles, a lot of these seemingly catastrophic news stories end up to be perhaps a little overblown, right? So I think being also a little bit selective in what we choose to spend our time on, what sort of developments we choose to really focus on is also better, because trust me, my friend, you know, mental health is no joke when it comes to studying this stuff, right? And especially in this sort of constantly online space that we're in, it's I think valuable to really get a breath of fresh air and step away as much as possible. This stuff's still going to be here when we get back to our desk. There's no rush. You know, we've got some time.
All right then. So you talked about, this importance of almost detaching out from this stuff for a while, right? So that it doesn't seem like the world is coming to an end and like, AI is going to take up or something of that sort, right? So Arthur, I would say it's been a very, very interesting conversation that I had with you, right? And hopefully the next conversation that we have is not, let's just say, on the rise of AI or something of that sort. And maybe someday soon we also sit across the room, right, with our team, and then we talk to you on, let's just say, a whole lot of other things. So with that, I would say thank you for coming up. Thank you for giving us time. It's been a wonderful conversation, and we hope that we keep talking to you again and again. So thank you so much, and it's been a delight talking to you.
Thank you so much. Had a great time. And yes, I would absolutely love to have another conversation. And if it can be in person, all the better.